Hey guys, it's Mr. Allen here. Today we're going to do a little review on ocean waves. It's something we spent some time on already, but I figured it would be good for all of us to refresh our memory. Here's a picture of Nazaré, Portugal. Um, Portugal is a small country that's kind of tucked into the southwest corner of the country of Spain, and they both kind of jut out into the eastern Atlantic Ocean. In recent years, this small coastal city of Nazaré has become world famous as having the hugest, largest surf on the planet. And you've got surfer daredevils coming from all over the place to surf these waves in the wintertime, is usually when they're big like this. Speaking of waves, what's a good definition? Well, here's one right here. A wave is the transmission of energy through matter. And what does that mean? That essentially means that whenever we see a wave, the matter within that wave is going to, we may see that it's moving back and forth or that it might rotate, but that ultimately the matter that's within that wave is going to return to its original position. So when we look at a wave, we're seeing this structure that appears to be propagating and moving, and certainly part of it is. And the part of the wave that's moving is the energy pattern of the wave. We see material that again is maybe moving back and forth or rotating, but that matter is staying put ultimately, and it's only the energy that's traveling forward. So waves transmit energy to adjacent matter, and that allows that energy to continue. And that's why these kind of waves that do that are called progressive waves. Turns out that there are three types of progressive waves out there: longitudinal, transverse, and orbital. And we're looking at some models of them here on the slide. Down in the bottom right, this is a longitudinal wave. It's a sort of an energy pattern, a wave that kind of compresses matter and then sort of stretches it at the same time as it moves. And then right beside it, we've got a transverse wave. And it's illustrated by this person holding a rope, and they kind of snap their hand, and it creates a serpentine sort of zigzag energy pattern that courses down the length of the rope. Up here, we've got the orbital wave, which basically lives up to its name. The matter that's being sort of agitated by the energy of an orbital wave is moving in an orbital circular pattern. It turns out that longitudinal waves and transverse waves actually have more to do with geology and earthquakes than oceanography. If you're ever in an earthquake and you feel the first vibration, what you're actually feeling is a longitudinal wave. This is what, when you've got movement on a fault and the seismic waves course out from the focus of the quake, it's going to be a longitudinal wave. The Earth's crust is going to be compressing and stretching as the energy moves through it. And then, maybe a few moments after that, you're going to feel a transverse wave. There's going to be sort of a zigzag side-to-side motion that may reach you. Interestingly enough, if the earthquake is really big, if it's a huge magnitude quake of like a 7 or an 8 or a 9, then there'll be a third kind of seismic wave that'll reach you, and it will be an orbital wave. It will be the seismic waves will be moving through the Earth's crust, and the crust, the energy will be orbital, and the Earth's crust will be sort of agitating, just as this model is here, just as waves would move on an open ocean. But that, of course, is an unusual event, and orbital waves are something that happen on bodies of water around the planet every day. I know you guys have seen this diagram. This is the parts of the wave. The highest part of the wave is the crest, the wave crest. The lowest part of the wave is going to be called the trough. And the distance between any identical part of the wave from a crest to a crest or from a trough to a trough is called the wavelength. And the wave height is the distance between the highest part of the wave, the crest, to the lowest part, the trough. And the amplitude of the wave is the distance between the crest to the average sea level. And here's the diagram of waves and wavelengths that show that orbital circular energy. And what we can see here is that orbital circular energy does not just exist at the surface of the water, it actually penetrates down deep into the water column. And these little circular energy patterns get smaller as they descend through the water column, and they go down to about half of a wavelength below the crest of the wave. And at that point, the orbital energy is negligible. Let's run through some terms that we've talked about previously. The first one is period. And a period is the time required for two waves to pass a fixed point. And then frequency is going to be the number of waves that are going to pass a fixed point within a single second. Of course, we've talked a little bit about the properties of the water molecule. And one of it has that cohesiveness, that clinginess. And so it has a tendency to remain static, to remain at rest, unless something disturbs it and gives it energy. And of course, there are disturbing forces out there that cause ocean waves. And the big three disturbing forces that exist, the first one's going to be wind, the second one's going to be changes in gravity. And by that we mean the gravitational effects of the moon and the sun on the ocean bodies around the planet. And then the third disturbing force is going to be seismic activity, and that would actually include volcanic activity also. But among those three disturbing forces, wind is going to be the most common disturbing force. Wind, as a disturbing force, wind is going to transfer energy to water through friction. You know, we've got the Earth's atmosphere. It's made up of oxygen molecules and nitrogen. And wind is essentially changing air pressure. Basically, you've got high pressure, you've got low pressure, and they're trying to equilibrate. They're trying to balance themselves out. So wind is going to be movement of air. And as it moves along the water, it's going to generate friction, and those water molecules are going to absorb that energy. So wind, and each one of these disturbing forces are going to produce their own distinct diagnostic wavelengths. What's a wavelength? That's essentially, we talked about it a moment ago, being the distance between identical points, from crest to crest or from trough to trough. But it's also indicative of the width of a wavelength. It sort of represents the width of these various waves. So wind commonly creates a wavelength of anywhere from 60 to 150 meters. The tides, the gravitational effects of the moon and the sun, are going to produce very large wavelengths. And those wavelengths are going to be as big as the ocean basins that they're in, that contain them. And then tsunamis are another phenomenon that creates very large, wide waves. And they're going to have a wavelength of roughly 200 kilometers, or about 120 miles. So we've got those disturbing forces that create waves, but then we also have restoring forces. And those are forces that tend to flatten waves. They bring water back to the level state. When it comes to tides, since the wavelengths of tides, you've got the gravitational tug of the moon in relation to the sun. The moon and the sun line up, and it creates spring tides, which we know are the highest high tides and the lowest low tides. So those forces are planetary. They're huge. They have a huge effect. As a result, basically, tides have these wavelengths that are as big as the ocean basin. So gravity and the Coriolis effect, you guys know what that is. That's the tendency of the Earth's rotation to deflect water or to deflect air in the atmosphere. So gravity and the Coriolis effect are the restoring forces for the tides, given their large scale size. Surface tension is another restoring force, but in this case, it's a restoring force for the smallest waves. Those smallest waves are basically wrinkle-sized. They're little ripple waves that are called capillary waves, and they're only 1.7 centimeters or less per wavelength. That's under an inch. Here's a pretty cool picture of capillary waves that are produced by falling water droplets. Another photo of capillary waves produced by a droplet. Waves this small are a result of surface tension. That's a property of water. We've all seen those pictures of water striders, those little insects with long legs running around on the surface of the water without sinking in. That's because of the Mickey Mouse molecule, H2O, which we see right here. We've got an oxygen atom that's covalently bonded with two hydrogen atoms. So this is your water molecule, and it's a strong bond. Both of the hydrogen atoms are bonded with the oxygen atom, but at the same time that they're bonded with the oxygen atom, these hydrogen atoms are attracted to other adjacent water molecules that are right beside it. So that weak hydrogen bond causes the clinginess, the cohesiveness, the surface tension of water. And it's an important property because it allows the atmosphere, it allows wind to transfer energy to it and to create waves. Of course, in a calm setting with a gentle wind, you're going to start off with these tiny little wrinkle capillary waves. They're going to be the first stage of wave generation. But eventually, they're going to develop into a groundswell formation. It's going to basically, wind is going to be blowing across the surface of the ocean, and it's going to begin with small wrinkles, capillary waves, and they're going to, as they absorb the friction from the wind, as they absorb that energy, they're going to build into ripples, into chops, into white caps, and maybe it's going to be disorganized and a little bit chaotic. But as they continue to absorb that energy, they're going to grow. And at a certain point, the weight of the wave will take over so that this small little capillary wave has grown into a choppy kind of white-capped wave. But at that point, it's going to be called a gravity wave. As we see here in this photo of whitecaps on a choppy sea, as those waves grow and they travel, they're going to become gravity waves. At certain points, like with the conditions we see here, wind and gravity may work against each other and you get these white caps, but sooner or later the waves are going to tend to organize themselves. These forces, they can be random, they can be chaotic, they can have variable intensity and duration, but eventually once these wave patterns start, they are going to tend to organize themselves into similar wavelengths and into patterns. And that's what surfers and oceanographers call swell, the rise and fall of uniform wave patterns on the sea. Groups of swells with similar characteristics are going to organize and travel together in wave trains, which surfers, this dude right here, would call a set. And as this set rolls in, he's trying to figure out which is the biggest and the best one to ride. And he's going to look for the biggest and the best to take the longest and fastest ride. While those wave trains, while those sets are moving through the deep water of the open ocean, their orbital energy patterns are unaffected by drag from the bottom of the seafloor. So they're able to progress and travel unaffected. Their motion is not obstructed at all. When that's the case, they're considered a deep water wave. Sooner or later, they're going to get into shallower water, and when the water that the wave moves into is shallower than 1/4 the wavelength, then the wave is going to start to feel drag off of the bottom, and that drag is going to affect the orbital energy patterns, and it's going to change the orbitals from circles into elliptical shapes. When the depth is about 1/20th of a wavelength, the wave will be considered a shallow water wave. And there are 3 other factors out there that are going to affect the growth of these wind waves. As these waves are being exposed to the wind, friction energy is being absorbed by the water. They're growing bigger. They're becoming almost like sails. Their surface area is increasing, which is allowing them to absorb more energy from the wind. So there are 3 important factors that help with this process. The first is wind speed. The wind speed has to be blowing faster than the wave is moving. If it isn't, then the wave won't be able to receive energy. Wind duration is really important. It's important for the wind to blow in a consistent direction for a long period of time. If the wind blows really hard for a short period of time, or if it changes directions frequently, then it's unlikely to generate large waves. Another important factor is something called fetch. And fetch refers to the overall surface area of a body of water that's being affected by wind and producing waves. This is a map of Ireland, Scotland, and England, and we can see here that the wind is roughly blowing out of the southeast, and we can see that the mean length of fetch here is 124 miles in this part of the basin. In between the Isle of Man and, say, Liverpool, the Sefton Coast, it's 68 miles. So there's different areas of fetch depending on the shape of the basin and what direction the wind's blowing. As these wave trains come together on the open water of the ocean, they can sort of meet. They can synchronize. In some cases, they can merge, and their individual energy can combine, and they can become larger as a result. That's called constructive interference. When you've got a wave train of 1 meter waves and it's in sync with the wave train, another 1 meter wave train, and they're both in sync and they basically merge in the open ocean, they're going to basically undergo this process of constructive interference, and the effect is they're going to grow into a perfectly synchronized wave that's twice as tall as it previously was. But then there's other situations where 1 meter waves are going to meet in the ocean and they're out of sync. For instance, the crest of one wave train is going to be synced to the trough of the other wave train, and they're going to be out of sync and they're going to merge. And when that happens, that's going to be destructive interference, and effectively those waves are going to cancel each other out. They're going to disappear themselves, more or less. Sooner or later, though, the circular orbitals are going to reach shallow water. They're going to approach the coast. As they do, they're going to go from a circular pattern They're going to start to feel the drag, the shallowness of the water. They're going to change into an elliptical pattern. And as those elliptical patterns approach even shallower water, the drag on the seafloor is going to increase. The circular energy is going to go vertical. It's going to crest, and ultimately a wave is going to break in the swash zone on the beach itself. That's going to happen. That's going to happen when the height to length ratio of the wave exceeds 1 to 7. And that's what we see going on here in this diagram as well. Deep water waves are going to transition into shallow water waves. Circular orbitals are going to go elliptical. The whole thing goes vertical. When the wave height to wave length ratio exceeds 1 to 7, that's when the wave is going to break. Another thing that can happen as waves approach shore at an angle is that they may refract, wave refraction. This happens because one part of the wave reaches the shallow bottom. If they're coming in at an angle, one part of the wave is going to reach the seafloor first. It's going to feel the drag first. It's going to slow down first, while the sort of lagging part of the wave is going to be in deeper water and still moving quicker because it is not feeling the effects of the shallow water and the drag just yet. That's going to cause that wave to basically curve, to turn, particularly if you've got a situation where there's a headland jutting out. Basically, the wave energy is going to concentrate towards the headland. The wave crest are going to turn toward it. That's wave refraction. So if we consider all of these processes that we've just talked about, things like fetch and constructive interference and wave refraction, what might happen in a situation where you've got thousands of miles of fetch, of wind fetch, across the open Atlantic Ocean, where you've got storm-driven winds that are pushing large swells towards southern Europe, towards the Iberian Peninsula, and towards the small country of Portugal. These waves are going to be moving in a northwest to southeast direction towards Portugal, and it's going to take days for them to get there, and the whole time the wind is going to be they're going to be absorbing that wind. They're going to be growing in energy and in wavelength. And then, just as these waves reach the coast, what if there isn't a shallow bottom there that's going to cause drag? But instead, what if there is a deep submarine canyon that's hundreds of meters deep and produces absolutely no drag at all, so that some of these waves are going to maintain their full speed all the way right up to the beach? And that's what we see in this diagram right here. In this particular setting, there's going to be one more unusual wrinkle, and that is that as these fast deep water waves exploit the deep water of this canyon, they're going to refract at the last moment and turn into shallow water, which is going to basically cause them to constructively interfere, to merge with other waves that are there, and that's going to sizably increase their mass and energy just before they reach the beach, just before they break. Well, in a situation like that, what would you have? You're going to have Nazaré, Portugal, because that's exactly what's going on just offshore in Nazaré. Here's a bathymetry map of the Nazaré Undersea Canyon. You can see that the waves are coming in waters that are almost 300 meters deep. And so they're able to move at full speed right up to the beach. There is no continental shelf here. There is no shelf at all. It's basically beach and then deep water just offshore. And that's why the waves are moving so fast here at Nazaré. They're moving so fast that the surfers can't even traditionally paddle into them. In order to catch a wave, a surfer's normally going to lie on his board and paddle into them, but these waves are so big and so fast that surfers have to be pulled in by jet skis. They have to be standing on their board, they're holding on to a rope, and they're pulled in by a jet ski. It's the only way that they can ride these waves and catch these waves. Um, Keep in mind also, when you look at the size of these waves compared to the people that are riding them, that 1 gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. And that if it turns out also that there are 660,000 gallons of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And if you fill up an Olympic-sized swimming pool with 660,000 gallons, the weight of that water is going to be 5,280,000 pounds. Looking at these waves that we see here at Nazare, how many Olympic-sized swimming pools do you suppose are in each one of these breaking waves? Do you think 50, 70, more than 100? The power in each of these waves is obviously massive. When they break, they're releasing millions of tons of force. The most dangerous place to be, of course, is right where the surfers are, which is just under the breaking lip. So far, no one's died. There have been no fatalities yet. But a few years ago, there was an unlucky English surfer who got completely hammered by the lip. He was blasted 30 yards into the air, and he wound up with a broken back. And this is a great aerial image that shows you the slope, the cliff of that underwater submarine canyon, Nazare submarine canyon. And you can see it's just yards right off the beach. I mean, you could swim out here and you'd be in water that's 60 meters deep and dropping right off, which explains the dynamics of the break here. These waves are anywhere from 40 to 60 to 80 up to 100 feet high. Okay, so moving on. Another type of destructive wave that exists out there is something called a storm surge. Storm surges are created by hurricanes. We've got a diagram here that shows a cross-section of a hurricane. We've got the eye right here, and we've got the eye wall. The eye wall is the strongest part of the hurricane, where the strongest hurricane force winds are. When you've got a hurricane like this that's transitioning off of the open ocean and moving onto dry land, it's going to push a pulse, a bulge of pressure-driven and wind-driven water ashore in front of it as the storm moves from water to land. And that's what this diagram below is showing. It's showing a storm surge that's going to breach like sand dunes and seawalls and completely inundate, flood, and destroy most coastal architecture. It turns out that the shallower the water is offshore, when a hurricane comes ashore, it's going to increase the power of the surge. And that's why the U.S. Gulf Coast has the most powerful storm surges, because it turns out that just offshore in many places of the Gulf, the bottom is very shallow. You can be in a flat bottom boat and be miles offshore in the Gulf, and you can be in waist deep water. So the water just offshore, you have to go out a long ways in the Gulf to get into deep water. And so therefore, the Gulf of Mexico coast has the biggest storm surges. They can be up to 30 feet high. And this computer animation here is showing us, just giving us an illustration of what a 10-foot storm surge would do to a flooded neighborhood. Hurricane winds cause most of the structural damage in hurricanes, but 90% of all deaths in hurricanes are caused by storm surges, and you can see why. The pulse just comes in and floods one-story buildings and the lower stories of other buildings, and people are caught unprepared, unaware. A seiche is another form of destructive wave that happens in lakes or enclosed bays. Seiches are wind-driven. For instance, here we've got, let's say we've got wind coming out of the west to the east across this enclosed lake, and the wind is pushing up a bulge of water on the east side of this basin. Well, what should happen if the wind suddenly ceases? What's going to happen is this wind-driven bulge is going to shift back rather rapidly, and it's going to be almost like a contained small-scale tsunami that can do damage to buildings and infrastructure on the other side of this lake or this bay. Seiches typically are well known in Lake Geneva, Switzerland, and they happen in the Great Lakes regularly. What about tsunamis? We know all about tsunamis. They're fast-moving waves that can travel thousands of kilometers. They're usually seismically created. They're caused by an earthquake on the seafloor. Typically, those earthquakes are going to happen in what's called the subduction zone, which, as you guys know already, is called a convergent boundary. Why is it called a convergent boundary? Because we've got two tectonic plates, and one of them, the seafloor plate, is slowly descending under the edge of a continental plate. Only in order for us to have an earthquake, the plate is going to have locked up, and it will stay jammed for a period of time until tectonic pressure builds and it finally ruptures, and that's going to be the cause of the earthquake. And when that happens, much water is going to be displaced in the course of the earthquake and send out shock waves that will ripple out in the form of not only an earthquake but a tsunami. And in 2011, off the coast of Japan, that happened in the Japanese Trench, this dark seam that we see here. This was a huge earthquake. It was a high 8, one of the largest quakes, and there was huge movement by the Pacific Plate during the earthquake. It slid almost 80 feet in 2 minutes, and that displaced a large amount of water. Huge shock waves ripping out, and that's what we're looking at here from a helicopter, Japanese TV, showing pulses of tsunamis heading for the Japanese coastline. 260 miles of Japanese coastline were impacted. There were multiple waves with heights varying from 20 to 70 feet. You can see one of them ripping through a pine forest here, heading towards this neighborhood of wood frame architecture. You can tell from the tilt of these buildings that some of them are already off their foundation, are already in the process of being broken up and pulverized. In some places, this tsunami traveled 6 miles inland. You can see it overflowing a seawall here in a fishing village, Miyako City. Most Japanese architecture is pretty fragile wood frame stuff. By the end of the day, 360,000 people were homeless. There are many low-lying farming and fishing communities that are built down near river deltas, down at the waterline, and most of these places were just wiped clean, were completely devastated. Over 19,000 people died during this event. It was a very bad day. And the cost of this disaster was $235 billion. Another notable tsunami happened, an unusual one happened in Latoya Bay, Alaska in 1958. What happened here was you had a narrow fjord-like bay that was almost enclosed, and on the back side of the bay, it backed up on mountains, and there were glaciers running off the mountains from the north, from the south, and from the east. This broken dotted line is a crack in the Earth's crust. It was a fault, and the earthquake happened along this fault, and when the earthquake broke and the crust moved along this fault, it triggered a massive slope failure, a huge rock slide that gave way. And this portion of this large cliff broke loose and just plunged into the water, and it created this enormous pulse that was 524 meters high. That's higher than the Empire State Building, higher than the World Trade Centers used to be. And this tsunami was created in the back part of the bay here, about 10 miles away, and it moved seaward, away from land, pulsing out of the bay, heading towards open water. Well, here at the mouth of the bay was a fishing village with a lot of boats anchored. And as the wave moved this way, some people were lucky enough to sort of ride over the tsunami. It started out as a wave that was 1,720 feet high. They know that because the forest here that's missing, that's been clear cut, that's been stripped away, used to extend to the water line. And the height of where this cut line is that high. It's 1,720 feet. And this aerial photo shows a trem line where a forest that previously extended to the water line was just completely stripped away. So this was a truly, singular event. Finally, we've got something called an internal ocean wave. We know that the ocean is stratified with by various properties. It can be there are different layers in the ocean based on salinity, on density, and on temperature. And in this case, we can see that the thermocline, which is one of those stratified layers of high density water, is rippling with an energy wave, with an internal energy wave itself that may be receiving some energy from the surface waves that we've just spent some time here talking about. Okay, well that pretty much wraps up our little review on ocean waves. And we will go over this a little more prior to the test. Thanks for listening, guys.